I don't think any of us are under any illusions that the AFL's fixturing and scheduling of games across the season is anything other than an absolute mess. From fans to players to the media and coaches, everyone would have a gripe somewhere when it comes to the equity of the draw.
Do you think it's fair on the competition?
There's no way that you could look at the draw and say it's fair anywhere. It's just, everyone understands it. It's just, which bit is yours? That's reality, isn't it? We play more games at the MCG than anyone else. Is that fair? Clearly not. And then how much West Coast and Freeman have to travel and the others, there's no way it is fair.
But just how flawed is the fixture? What is the depth of the levels of inequality? And are there any viable solutions? Let's dive in and take a look. Welcome to AFL Insight. The biggest hindrance towards achieving a fair and balanced draw is the fact that the AFL is comprised of 18 teams, each of whom play 23 games across the season. There is a math problem before we even get started. Each team plays the 17 others once, leaving 6 remaining games, and this is where the process becomes convoluted. There is no structure, no rotation as to who those 6 teams are that your club plays twice. There are some loose guidelines around ladder positioning from the previous season, yet the same teams seem to end up playing the same opponents year after year, which I'll illustrate shortly. Of the 23 games, each side is allocated 11 home and 11 away games. 14 teams then play an opponent at a neutral venue in South Australia during gather round, leaving 2 teams to face the Crows and Power on their home turf, meaning those 2 South Australian sides get an extra home game every year. The first example of an unfair disparity in the fixture. Now, before South Australians turn this video off, I am well aware of the travel disparity that also exists, and we will get to that. But for now, let's just lay out the facts and call a spade a spade. And the reality is that both Adelaide and Port Adelaide receive 12 home games per year, whilst the 16 remaining sides each have 11. So during my research for this video, I did some homework on 4 different leagues from overseas and studied their structures in order to ascertain whether they face the same scheduling issues. The NBA, NHL and NFL from the United States, and the English Premier League. The NBA and NHL are structured similarly, with both having 82 regular season games, 41 home and 41 away. As there are 30 plus teams in all of these American leagues, the teams are halved into conferences and then split into smaller divisions within those conferences. So using the NBA as an example, each team will play the 15 teams from the opposite conference twice, once at home and once away for 30 games total. They will play the 4 teams within their own division 4 times each for 16 games total. The remaining 36 games are split between the 10 teams left in their conference. 6 of these teams are played 4 times each, whilst the remaining 4 are played 3 times each. Why does any of this matter? And what is the relevance to the AFL? Well, it's the method behind the madness that matters. Just as 18 does not go into 23 evenly, 30 NBA teams into 82 games does not fit evenly. Yet the NBA has still come up with a formula that provides parity for all teams. To equalise the numbers as to which teams play each other 3 or 4 times, the NBA adopted a 5-year rotation policy. Under this method, every single NBA team over a 5-year period plays 20 games against their division rivals, 18 games against the remaining conference opponents, and 10 games against teams on the opposite side of the country. No exceptions. There is no extra emphasis placed on the game's greatest rivalry in the Lakers versus Celtics. It matters not whether your team is relevant or where they are placed in the standings. All that matters is the same even playing field for all teams. And despite the complexities at hand, the NBA have managed to achieve this. Are the more storied franchises favoured with marquee time slots and national television coverage? Absolutely. But that becomes a matter of supply and demand. And relevance. The point is that the NBA don't leverage off of the prestige of one of the greatest rivalries in sporting history in order to gain increases in eyeballs on their sport and their bottom line. As you will soon see, the AFL cannot say the same. The English Premier League could not be structured more equitably. 20 teams who all play each other twice, once at home and once away, for a total of 38 games. And if a team plays at home on Boxing Day, then they play away on New Year's Day, and vice versa. They also ensure that no team is scheduled to start or finish the season with 2 away games. Why? Because they don't believe it's fair. Bravo. The NFL seems to have just as many issues as the AFL, but this is more understandable when you consider the fact that they have substantially more teams than rounds of football games. If we think it's hard to find parity fitting 18 teams into 23 rounds, imagine having to fit 32 teams into 17 matches per season. But having said that, despite the obvious constraints of division and conference play, the NFL still managed to rotate the schedule to a point where every team plays each of the other 31 at least once in a 4-year period. So just how deep exactly is the disparity within the AFL fixture? Let's have a closer look. Now, as we are all aware, the Collingwood Football Club is one of, if not the biggest club in the land. From ratings to merchandise to attendances and memberships. Let's face it, the Pies are at the top of the tree when it comes to relevance. They are an absolute cash cow and everyone wants to play them twice in a season. And from 1970 to 1986, when the then VFL expanded out to 22 games per season, everybody did. In that 17-year span, every single team played 1 home and 1 away game against the other 11 clubs for a total of 34 games. Perfect parity was achieved. In 1987, when the Eagles and Bears joined, the fairness of the competition became compromised. But at this early stage, the VFL had a rotation policy in place, and we can see that the amount of games played against Collingwood stayed relatively even. In 1991, the Crows had earned the 15th licence, and for the first time we had the introduction of byes. Now, despite this further weakening the integrity of the competition, the AFL again managed to rotate matches appropriately and evenly, with the Dogs and Saints playing as many games against the Pies as the Blues and Bombers in the 4-year period between the introduction of the Crows in 91 and the Dockers in 95. The 2 seasons before the introduction of the Power in 1997 was the beginning of the disparity that continues to this day. In the years 1995 and 1996, the Blues and Bombers both played the Pies twice each season, the only teams to do so. The 3 teams that played the Pies just once, North Melbourne, Footscray and Fitzroy. So was this the genesis of the AFL prioritising profits over equality? Let's have a look at how things have played out since. In the 28 years since 1996, 55 is the maximum amount of games that a team could have played against Collingwood. Hawthorn is third in that period with 41 matches. Excluding the Giants and Suns, the Dockers are last with just 33 matches. The Blues and the Bombers? Well, Carlton has played 53 of a possible 55 matches, missing out on double-ups in 2017 and 2019, whilst the Dons have played 54 of a possible 55, with 2016, I wonder what happened in that year, the only year that they didn't double up with Collingwood. From 1992 until 2016, the Carlton and Essendon football clubs played the Magpies twice every single season. If we drill down into the last 14 years since the Gold Coast Suns were introduced, the chasm between the haves and have-nots is growing ever wider. The Giants are yet to have a double-up against the Pies in 13 years of existence. The Suns and Dockers have had one, as have the Saints, which was all the way back in 2011. At a time when there was parity and a rotation mechanism in place, the Saints played 51 of a possible 54 games against the Pies between 1970 and 1996, just behind the Dons at 52 and the Blues at 53. Fast forward 30 years, and the poor old Sainers can't get a look in for a double up. The Doggies and Kangas don't fare much better with just 2 double ups across the last 14 seasons. And I'm sure that there will be those of you out there thinking that the AFL needs to be a viable business and generate money for the growth of the game. But at what cost? A home game for these clubs with smaller followings is worth its weight in gold, but it is a luxury seldom afforded. Now, we're supposed to believe that the AFL has put measures in place that separate the ladder into 3 sections, and the order in which a club finishes determines who they play the following season. Yet the same teams continue to play each other year after year, decade after decade. It's complete and utter hogwash. The AFL has consistently shown that lining its pockets is more important than the integrity of the game. So let's move away from the smaller clubs and focus on Geelong. Has this team put a foot wrong since the late 80s? They are a model of consistency who are as deserving as any for a seat at the table with the big boys. In the 10-year period between 1987 and 1996, the Cats had 6 double-up games against the Magpies. In the 28 years since, they've had 7. So what does this actually mean for Collingwood on the field? Well, it can be, and has been, a massive advantage for the Pies. The Blues are a gun side now, but for the first 20 years of this century, they were anything but. Between 2002 and 2023, the Magpies had a win-loss record of 28-11 against the Blue Baggers. 71.7%. In that similar time frame, the Cats went 19-5. Yet they had 15 fewer goes at Carlton in that period. The Hawks had an even better record against the Blues, going 22-3 from 2001 to 2020, but only got 5 extra goes at Carlton compared to Collingwood's 17 double-ups. North went 13-4 against the Blues from 2005 to 2019, but had just the 2 double-up matches. It's a similar story with the Bombers. The Dogs didn't get a double-up with the Dons between 2015 and 2023, a period in which they went 8-1 against the lads from Tullamarine. Fewer games during a time when you have the wood over an opponent is obviously a disadvantage. Essendon and Carlton have been mediocre for the best part of 2 decades, and the Pies have been able to exploit this and gain a competitive advantage. From 2009 to 2023, the Pies played the Blues and Dons 54 times and came away with a record of 39-15. In that same period, the Cats, against the same opposition, went 27-8. 20 less chances to assert themselves from a position of dominance. There is also the financial component. This next graph shows how many double-up games each team has had against the 3 biggest drawing Victorian clubs in Carlton, Collingwood and Essendon since the inception of the Suns in 2011. The Pies are a part of the big 3, yet still have the most double-ups in that period, whilst at the other end of the scale, the Dogs have had just 6, 2 against each of the big 3 in a 14-year period. How much does this affect the bottom line of the Doggies? Since the turn of the century, the Bulldogs have played in just 79 games, where the attendance has cracked 40,000 plus. 40 of those 79 matches have involved either the Magpies or the Bombers. The Cats are in a similar boat, consistently drawing anywhere from 40 to 85,000 against these 3 teams, yet are not getting a regular enough crack at it. It's not good enough, and fans deserve better. But fans also want blockbusters. Well, let's dive into that next. We've just recently celebrated the spectacles that were the King's Birthday and King's Birthday Eve games. Both were attended by 80,000 plus people and are now locked in as permanent fixtures, forever owned by the 4 big Victorian pioneers who created these blockbusters. But what if I told you that in 1991, 3 games were held in Victoria on Queen's Birthday, with all starting at 2:10. the now owners of the annual Easter Monday clash in Geelong and Hawthorn played each other at Princess Park. Melbourne and Richmond, who now have sole rights to Anzac Eve, played off at the MCG, whilst the Saints hosted the Kangas at Moorabbin. The highest attended game was the 31,000 that watched St Kilda against North Melbourne. Higher again than that was the crowd who turned up to Football Park on the Sunday night to watch the Crows take on Fitzroy for the first ever Queen's Birthday Eve clash. Fast forward 12 months and the Saints fans get rewarded for their efforts of the previous season with a match-up against Collingwood at the MCG. 80,000 turn up for the third highest attended game of the year and witnessed an epic, with the Saints minus Tony Lockett getting home by a point. The game was rotated a year later and the D's and Pies played in front of 57,000, some 20+ thousand short of the Saints and Pies. The Crows again had a crack at the Sunday evening game, and this time 45,000 turned up to watch them play the Dogs. In 1994, the Tigers and Collingwood had their turn and drew 62,000 through the gates, whilst a year later, in 1995, Melbourne and Carlton played in front of 53,000. In 1996, the Crows hosted a Queen's Birthday Eve game for the third time in 6 years, and once again filled the stadium with 43,000 fans rocking up. Melbourne hosted Collingwood the next day, and just 48,000 people showed. In 1997, we had the bizarre doubleheader of the Blues hosting Brisbane, whilst North hosted the Dockers, with both games attended by less than 30,000 people. 1998, however, was something to behold. North hosted Collingwood and drew in 58,000, 10,000 more than the D's and Pies clash from 2 years previous, whilst at Waverley, the Saints got their third chance to be involved in a Queen's Birthday clash and hosted the Tigers. 71,500 people rocked up, further solidifying the Saints' credentials as a team worthy of regular blockbusters. But instead we went back to Collingwood versus Melbourne in 1999, and this time they barely cracked 40,000 attendees. A year later, in 2000, a bigger crowd turned up to the Crows' fourth crack at a Queen's Birthday Eve match, whilst almost 50,000 would watch the Tigers host the Doggies. Their reward for drawing 10,000 more people than the Pies and D's did the year previous? Banished. Collingwood and Melbourne got yet another crack in 2001 and have held it ever since, and now apparently have ownership rights. The Crows had close enough to 3 full houses in their last 3 goes at a Queen's Birthday Eve game, but it seems as though they weren't pioneering enough for the AFL's liking. They could not have done more. The Saints could not have done more, drawing 70,000 plus out to Waverley and 80,000 to the MCG. It took the D's and Pies 21 tries from 1993 to 2018 to gain a bigger attendance. Yet here both teams sit without a marquee match, as Collingwood, Melbourne, Carlton and Essendon now have multiple. I could tell you a similar story about Anzac Day. Almost 73,000 crammed into Waverley Park in 1992 to watch the Hawks take on the Magpies. Yet just 3 years later, it became owned by Essendon and Collingwood. And what if I told you that on the eve of that inaugural clash between the Pies and the Bombers in 1995, that 62,500 people turned up to the MCG on a Monday night to watch Richmond and North Melbourne battle it out. A crowd that superseded Melbourne and Richmond's first 2 goes at the game in 2015 and 2016. A decade later, in 2005, the Anzac Eve game was trialled again when the Saints hosted Richmond at Marvel Stadium. 49,500 people packed the joint. Those Saints fans again, hey? I could tell you a similar story about Easter Monday, but I think you get my point. And in the end, during the height of the Kennett curse, 68,000 turn up to watch Hawthorn play Geelong, and once again, that day is now owned. no more rotations, no more chances for any other clubs to even get a look in. How and when does this ownership of a date or time slot get decided? Thursday night has become a marquee time slot, but it wasn't always the case. Between 2014 and 2018, the AFL trialled 4 or 5 Thursday night games in the middle of the season, before deciding it was worth pursuing further. But prior to that, there was a team out west who was the Thursday night pioneer, who in hindsight has become more of a guinea pig. The Eagles played the sole Thursday night game in seasons 2011, 2012 and 2013 against Melbourne, Carlton and Essendon respectively. All drew crowds in the mid 30,000 range. So why then did the Eagles not have a mortgage on Thursday nights? Instead, they haven't had one at home since before the pandemic, June of 2019. How is this fair? The argument has become relevance. If a team is irrelevant, they become buried in the graveyard slots of the fixture until such time as they work their way out. But no matter how relevant they become, those blockbuster marquee centerpieces are never within reach. I would argue that this is extremely short-sighted. Let's go back to 1992, when the Saints and Pies attracted 80,000 fans on Queen's birthday and 73,000 watched Collingwood and Hawthorn on Anzac Day. The highest attended match that season was Collingwood versus Essendon, with 88,066 people turning up. No special day or time slot required, because it's not needed. Carlton and Collingwood was the second highest attended match, with 83,000 people. As mentioned earlier, the Saints and Pies had the third highest attendance, the Hawks and Pies Anzac game was 5th, whilst the Dogs and Pies ranked 6th, with almost 68,000 turning up to watch them play. It was a similar story in 1993. Collingwood and Essendon had the highest attended match on Easter Monday, when 87,638 people showed up. But 87,573 people turned up to the second encounter between the two sides in that season, whilst Carlton versus Collingwood were ranked 3rd and 4th, with around 85,000 in attendance. The Dogs and Pies again drew the 6th biggest crowd. In 1994, the last year before Collingwood and Essendon put a mortgage on Anzac Day, the 4 games between Carlton and Collingwood and Essendon again dominated the top 5, whilst this time a young North Melbourne team led by Wayne Carey attracted over 72,000 to the MCG twice in their matches against Collingwood to rank 6th and 7th in attendance. And I believe what this illustrates is that people just want to see good footy. The Saints had a star-studded lineup in the early 90s, led by the likes of Lockett, Winmar, Lowe, Harvey, Burke and Frawley, and they attracted big crowds. St Kilda versus Collingwood was the second highest attended match in both seasons 1990 and 1991, and then 3rd in 1992. North Melbourne were box office in the 90s and regularly cracked the top 10 highest attended matches of the season. Hell, the Roos and Doggies had the same amount of attendees watch their 1998 Friday night game at the MCG as the Blues and Bombers did when they clashed on Easter Monday in the same season. What's the odds we ever see that again? So if Collingwood and Essendon have shown a history of drawing 85,000 people regardless of the day or time, Carlton and Collingwood the same, Essendon and Carlton the same, do they even need a public holiday event to showcase these matches? I want to take you back to 2009. The Cats and Saints played one of the greatest and most memorable home and away encounters of all time in front of 54,000 at Marvel, which still remains a record for the venue. A few months later, they played an epic grand final. Both teams were relevant and filled with stars like Ablett, Rewalt, Selwood, Del Santo, Scarlett, Kaczynski, Stevie J, Montagna, Chapman, etc. Could you imagine if they had played on Anzac Day in 2010? Would that perfect storm of style, form, relevance, star power, and recent history have seen a crowd in excess of 85,000? Absolutely. Did Jimmy Bartell and Lenny Hayes deserve the chance to go head-to-head for an Anzac medal and add some more prestige to the award? Absolutely. Would 85,000 have rocked up to see Collingwood versus Essendon on a Friday night on Anzac weekend? Absolutely. Because their fans are freaking awesome. So if you can draw 85,000 to both games, the net result of 170,000 is going to be way more than the 145,000 that was actually achieved. Isn't this actually the best outcome for all involved? Players win because they get to showcase their talents on the biggest stage. Neutral fans win because they get to witness the best possible game. Clubs win because they draw bigger crowds, and the AFL wins because of the extra 30,000 bums on seats. I'm interested to know what you guys think. Obviously it wouldn't work every year, but on those rare occasions when the stars align, could two teams that are not one of Collingwood, Essendon or Carlton draw 85,000 plus to the MCG on Anzac Day? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Alright, so buys have been a hot topic of late, and you know it's not going well when a coach who has been the biggest benefactor of the buy says that things need to change.
Even that, I still think that next year it'd be ideal. It wouldn't be ideal if teams had two buys and some didn't have one again. I think in an uneven competition that's got disparities everywhere with travel and home ground advantages and all of that. It's not an even competition. Anyone that says it is not talking sense. But that could be one thing that maybe that we can control as a competition that might be worth thinking about for next year.
In what world did the AFL think it would be acceptable to schedule multiple teams to have two buys before sides had even had one? It is just ludicrous and should never have been allowed to happen. Turning our attention back overseas, the NFL schedules their bye weeks between rounds 5 and 14. And again, this is not ideal. Some teams are more heavily favoured than others, and whilst I was researching some critiques of the NFL fixture, I found this amazing website called Sharp Football Analysis, which is basically an education platform for betting on the NFL. There is some amazing data within the site, and I stumbled upon a tool the host uses which analyses exactly how much rest between games each team gets compared to their opponent. So as an example, when the Pies and Dons met on Anzac Day, Collingwood had played the previous week on the Saturday, whilst Essendon played on the Friday night, giving them a net rest rating of +1, and the Pies a -1. So I borrowed this idea and applied it to the 2024 season thus far. This is the result. Using this data, I was able to ascertain that heading into the round 15 clash between the Swans and the Cats, Sydney had a net rest differential of +18, whilst the Cats sat at a -15. The difference in rest between the two sides was 33 days, or almost 5 weeks difference. The Cats, of course, were one of the teams who was yet to have a bye, whilst the Swans were fresh off their second. Is it any wonder then that after trailing at half-time, the Swannies were able to kick 11 goals to 6 in the second half as Chad Warner exploded past tired opposition? The Eagles and Dockers both have the league's largest travel disparity and have to deal with having the largest negative rest differential to boot. Do the AFL even take this type of data into consideration? There just appears to be no rhyme or reason as to how and why the AFL schedule buys the way they do. The Suns and Giants both played on the Sunday in round 3. Both had the bye in round 4 and then played each other in round 5. Perfect scheduling as neither gained a rest advantage over the other. Fast forward 10 weeks and we have the farcical situation where the Dogs face consecutive weeks of playing teams coming off in Brisbane's case, a second bye, and then Fremantle after their first bye. Back-to-back weeks of a -5 net rest differential, compounded by the fact that the doggies are also yet to have their own bye. I found this comment from Damien Hardwick interesting when byes were discussed earlier in the season.
I'm not a buy-in for the rest factor, but what you can do is you can actually get some coaching in. And Fly, I think they just came off the bye as well, so he'd probably tell you. And I think I heard some comments where he said, they worked heavily on some ball movement patterns over the bye break. And, that's the thing within training at the moment. You very rarely, you probably get an hour and a half to 2 hours a week to train the players. So, a lot of it's doing it on tape and all this. So you do actually, by having the bye, it does enable you to get a couple of extra sessions in where you can train a little bit harder.
This guy is a 3-time premiership coach and has much less concern about the rest time than he does about preparation time. In the first example I gave of the Suns and Giants, both sides had the same amount of rest and prep time to square off with each other. In the latter example, the Dogs not only have to deal with the cumulative workload inequality, but also an opposition who has had an extra week to prepare for them. Which raises the question, are byes even necessary? All they do is further complicate an already convoluted process. The Premier League doesn't have them, the NHL and NBA have a week off mid-season to facilitate an all-star game. And when you look at it, the bye is a relatively modern thing. For the best part of 100 years, our league was able to thrive without them. Teams played 22 consecutive weeks, and then those that made finals went straight into September without a break. It was a war of attrition, where the strongest survived at a time when players were not professional footballers and had day jobs as chippies, sparkies, and cleaners, knocking off early to go to training. Now we have teams having their second bye at round 12, and then a pre-finals bye. Give me a break. In an age where sports science, recovery, and being able to dedicate yourself full-time to the sport is the norm, players should be better equipped to handle a bigger load. But instead it's the opposite. They want more rest, shortened quarters, and even a shortened season? But of course, more money. What an absolute joke. Given the game was more combative and players had no rest, I assume that injury rates in the 80s must have been sky high and clubs must have been using more players than they do now. So I looked into it. Our last 3 seasons of grand finalists used the following amount of players during the season. In the 3 consecutive seasons that the Hawks and Bombers played off in the mid-80s, this is how their numbers looked. Slightly in favour of the 80s. Amazing. Perhaps the cumulative fatigue opened the game up and led to a more attacking version of our great game as well. Well, that's a discussion for another day. So again, I pose this question to you all. Armed with all of the information, and given all of the complications they cause, are byes necessary? And if so, in what form should they take? Alright, let's move on to travel. Non-Victorian teams have battled with this since they were added to the league, but just how big is the differential in travel? Now, in my research for this, I found some conflicting data in the numbers and ended up going with the Herald Sun model. And as we can see, not only do West Coast and Fremantle have less cumulative rest, they also have to travel sometimes up to 4 or 5 times more than their opponents in Victoria. There is no getting around their geographic isolation, but are there any viable solutions that would solve this issue? Let's look at some possible fixes before we wrap this sucker up. This season, we saw the Melbourne Football Club play consecutive games in Adelaide prior to and inclusive of Gather Round. They stayed in South Australia for the week, and surely this has to become normalised. An NBA team that resides on the West Coast can be on the road for an East Coast trip for up to 8 games at a time. Hell, in my previous job, I had to go to national conferences on the Gold Coast for a week at a time, leaving my wife and young family at home. Also had education courses in Sydney that took up similar amounts of time. I wasn't even on 6 figures, let alone the $500,000 that an average AFL player earns. Is one possible solution that the Eagles and Dockers knock out multiple games on the road, like the Demons did, and cut that travel burden down? Would it be too much to have the Dockers, for example, fly into Brisbane on a Saturday to face the Lions on a Sunday, spend a week on the Gold Coast before facing the Suns on a Saturday night, and finish it off by taking on the Giants in Sydney on the Friday night? It's 3 games in 13 days, but is this where the game needs to head in order to alleviate some of these disparities in travel? World-class athletes spend the majority of their year travelling from country to country. Young teens chase US scholarships and are away from home and family for years. A huge sacrifice. Is 3 games in 13 days, with 10 days on the Gold Coast with your mates jammed in between, really that big of a sacrifice in comparison? Now, it seems a no-brainer to not schedule the Eagles and Dockers in Hobart, but logic goes out the window when it comes to the AFL. And I think Gather Round just has to be rotated. An extra home game every 2nd or 3rd year and smarter scheduling would see a meaningful reduction in travel time for our brothers out west who have contributed so much to our great game. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of buys, but I'm living in dreamland to think that the AFLPA would willingly go backwards. There just has to be some fairness around them, however. A week off in the middle of the season for all teams would be ideal. But again, there ain't no way this is ever going to happen. There is no willingness to have a showcase game mid-season a la the All-Star games in the US, which is a shame, as we never get to see the best 40 or 50 players that our sport has to offer go head-to-head. But that's a discussion for another time. The fairest solutions would be for 10 teams to have a bye at round 11, with the other 8 having theirs at round 12. Because what has transpired this season simply cannot happen again. Having an opening round structured the way it was farcical. And if it continues next year, the teams that play in the first week need to play amongst themselves in week 2. We can't have those of whom who have already had a taste of the real thing coming up against teams that are yet to put their toes in the water in the 2nd week, as occurred this year. And we definitely can't have teams having 2 byes before others have had 1. What nonsense. I think there is a time and place for blockbusters to be shared around between teams of relevance, but would happily concede this point if it meant fairness across the board. I mentioned at the top that 17 opponents into 23 games was a math problem. But like most math problems, there are viable and logical solutions. 23 matchups multiplied by 3 years equals 69 games. 17 opponents multiplied by 4 matches equals 68 games. There is a world that exists where each team would play 4 games against 16 opponents in a 3-year span and 5 games against the 17th opponent, obviously a derby, showdown, Q-clash, bridge game for non-Victorian teams, and either a rotation or agreed upon arrangement for Victorian clubs. Isn't this a much fairer solution of rotating over a designated time period, just like the NBA, NHL and NFL have done, to ensure that equity for all teams is achieved? It certainly seems that way to me, but I might just be in the minority of people who value integrity over the almighty dollar. Anyways, that's enough from me. Again, this was much longer than anticipated, but when you take a deep dive in, it's worth uncovering what it is that you've found. For those that stuck around, thank you, and I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts around the fixture and subsequent scheduling of games. So make sure to comment below and let us know how you'd fix the fixture. And if you haven't already, I'd appreciate if you could like and subscribe. I'd love to keep making these videos for you all, as there are so many more stories to tell and truths to uncover. Thanks for watching AFL Insight. We'll see you next time.